Well, thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to share a few thoughts with you this afternoon, and well done on finding the lecture theatre, which is the first accomplishment of the day, I always feel, getting through the maze here. It's especially good, of course, to be here in the college that was once where, as you will know, Charles Darwin was a student from 1828 to 1831, and so a great pleasure also to be sharing a little bit about evolution along with my colleague later on, who's a proper evolutionary biologist. I've simply used it in my career as the framework within which all my previous research in molecular biology, molecular immunology has been carried out. I thought I would choose as many controversial words as possible in the title to start us off this afternoon, because I think that's a good way to get a discussion going. Obviously, we can only touch very briefly on some of these ideas, but as I say, hopefully that will be good to get us thinking about the whole history of evolution and where it's going and where it has been. So I'm going to start by reflecting on the many ways in which the grand theories of science, evolution in particular, have been used ideologically for various purposes. So evolution has often been presented as a theory based on chance and randomness for ideological purposes. I'm going to look at that firstly. Second, I'd like us to look at those slippery terms, chance and randomness, and how they're used in biology compared to how they're used in other fields. And third, I'll highlight a few recent biological discoveries that illustrate the ways in which the overall process of evolution, I think, now looks more consistent with ideas of constraint and directionality, even purpose maybe, than it did perhaps even a few decades ago. I've been interested in the various ideologies that are extracted out of scientific theories for some years now. In fact, a few years ago, after we founded the Faraday Institute, I co-organized a writer's workshop together with the historian, the late Ronald Numbers, who sadly died fairly recently. He was co-editor of the 8-volume CUP Cambridge History of Science. And together we recruited 13 quite well-known historians to come to Cambridge and discuss together for a few days before they wrote their 13 chapters of their book, which came to be called Biology and Ideology, from Descartes to Dawkins, published by Chicago University Press, with each chapter focusing on the way in which a particular scientific theory has been used historically in support or to extract a particular ideological purpose. The typical process is, I think, that a big theory of science, like evolution, becomes highly successful, and then various interest groups move in to try and utilize the prestige of that particular theory to support their particular ideology. Sometimes the actual science is misunderstood or misinterpreted in a way that helps the ideology to sound more credible. Other times the scientific theory is well understood, but then the ideology simply becomes sort of attached to it like a barnacle to a ship's hull. Either way, the unfortunate end result is that the actual meaning of the label given to the theory itself changes, especially in the public domain, and so the biological theory of evolution becomes socially transformed into this ideological idea derived from evolution. And so in the history of evolutionary theory, we see evolution being used in support of capitalism, communism, racism, militarism, eugenics, feminism, theism, atheism, probably quite a few other isms I've missed out. I've given a few illustrations up there, and obviously that's a very long history to look at that in detail. But as we noticed, some of these ideologies like capitalism and communism are opposites, but evolution as a philosophy or as an ideology has been used in support of both. And I think this process of social transformation helps to explain some of the confusion that can happen when evolution is brought into discussion with religious ideas or religious worldviews. And one of the ideologies, as I say, that has frequently been attached to evolution, that it's a theory based on chance and randomness. Some thinkers have therefore drawn the conclusion that the theory is incompatible with the idea of purpose or directionality. If that were really true, then clearly this would bring the theory into conflict with religious ideas. For example, here's the atheist American philosopher, the late Daniel Dennett, who asks whether the complexity of biological diversity, and I quote, can really be the outcome of nothing but a cascade of algorithmic processes feeding on chance. And if so, who designed that cascade? Close quote. And it then goes on to answer his own rhetorical question by saying, nobody, it is itself the product of a blind algorithmic process, adding that evolution is not a process that was designed to produce us. I think one should always be wary when you encounter that little phrase, nothing but, often labeled as nothing buttery, more formally known as scientism or perhaps ontological reductionism. But I think it's interesting to compare that quote now with a Christian commentator, in this case the late Philip Johnson, who is founder of the intelligent design movement, as he rejects Darwinian evolution as being a theory of chance and therefore anti-Christian. And I quote here from Philip Johnson, the modern neo-Darwinian theory of evolution insists that evolution is an unplanned, undirected process. It combines elements of chance and necessity or natural law, a combination of random genetic changes or mutations which accumulate through natural selection. These are impersonal material forces reflecting no pre-existing intelligence and no guidance. As the outcome of this process, human beings are essentially unplanned acts of nature, close quote. And I think what's interesting in these quotes is to see that an atheist like Daniel Dennett, he's attaching, if you like, a purposeless ideology to evolutionary theory. And then you have a Christian like Philip Johnson basically doing the same. And I think what we have here are ideologies that basically just misrepresent the theory in question. Anyway, let's just start then properly by looking at how chance and randomness are actually involved in the evolutionary process. The word chance in English, as in so many languages, is a very slippery one. It has a number of different meanings, and here I'm just going to review, if you like, the two main meanings of chance relevant to our present topic. The first is sometimes called epistemic chance because it refers to all those events that are perfectly law-like in how they happen, but about which we have insufficient knowledge of their antecedents to make predictions, for example, tossing a coin. The second main type of chance we can call, if you like, ontological chance, because there are no antecedents that could be possibly known even in principle, and this is sometimes, of course, called pure chance, because there's nothing that we can know which has predictive value. And of course, quantum events provide the best example, illustrated here in the decay of p32 phosphorus. So if we want proper chance, pure chance, to come into the evolutionary process, we can ask the question, is the ontological chance of quantum mechanics at all relevant to the mechanisms of evolutionary biology? And the answer I want to give here is only indirectly, without playing any kind of central role. And the reason is quite simple, really, that in the vast majority of biological processes, specific single events at the quantum level don't make any difference because they're all averaged out. And this is because, of course, evolutionary processes involve molecules, cells, organisms, in other words, levels of organization in which each item represents the average of trillions of quantum events. Now, when you dig down to the quantum level in biology, there certainly seem to be single quantum events important in some biological mechanisms still being researched in various areas, for example, in photosynthesis, also in vision, in, of course, DNA mutations, in the action of various enzymes, and also probably in the mechanisms whereby animals navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. And I think that's still a little bit discussed, not quite clear yet. But in all cases, the quantum events are playing roles in overall systems which are highly organized and orderly with consistent functions and outputs. They're not some hidden source of pure chance coming into biological processes viewed at least at the functional level, and that's the level, of course, where we're speaking about evolution. But let's do a thought experiment just for studying this in a little more detail. Could one maybe invoke ionizing radiation as a source of pure chance within the evolutionary process? Let's say, for example, an ionizing radiation particle might cause the death of lion A from cancer at one moment when that would not have happened had the particle been emitted at another moment. For example, the lion had just entered a cave and so was protected from radiation. But if lion A did get cancer and was no longer alive to eat antelope B, then antelope B goes on to have a large and successful family of antelopes. Now, the precise trajectory of future evolution might be affected once this particular mutation had occurred. But notice the proviso here, precise trajectory. For natural selection to occur, the source of genetic variation is irrelevant. Natural selection ensures that the overall process, I would suggest, is one of epistemic rather than ontological chance. So, having considered two of the main meanings of chance, we'll come back to epistemic in a moment. We've considered epistemic and ontological. Now let's just think for a moment about how the word random is used in evolutionary biology as contrasted with its use in mathematics. When biologists speak of random mutations in evolution, they're referring to the fact that genetic variation occurs in an organism without the well-being or otherwise of that particular organism. Their occurrence is not influenced by the needs of the individual organism in which they occur, although that assumption can be discussed, but let's just keep to the traditional definition just for a moment to make the point. Now, if we look in mathematics, of course, that's a different situation. Here we find that mathematicians typically use the word random to describe processes in which multiple outcomes can occur, and each is associated with a probability that gives the likelihood of that outcome. So, if we take a string of numbers, if the numbers are randomly selected, then any single number in a series will have an equal probability of being selected. Okay, now we can come back to biology and ask whether this mathematical understanding of randomness is a feature of evolutionary mechanisms, and I think the answer is clearly no. Now, the best place to look for randomness might be in mutational changes in the sequences of an organism's DNA. If mutations in the 3.2 billion nucleotides, those are genetic letters that make up our own human DNA, were truly random, then of course they'd be most likely to occur at any position, but this is not the case. I could give many examples. This on the screen is a recent Dutch study. What they did was to take 200 family trios, that's the mother, father, and the baby, the offspring, and they had their genomes completely sequenced. Now, given that on average 38 new mutations appeared in the newborn that were not there in the parents, if the mutations were randomly distributed throughout the genome, then on average they should be separated by a median of around 84 million nucleotides. But they are not. For example, the researchers found that there were 78 instances in which there were clusters of 2 to 3 mutations found within 20,000 nucleotides of each other, which is certainly a very much smaller number than 84 million. And in fact, a recent review listed around 8 different ways in which the molecular machinery involved in DNA replication can lead to a greater probability that mutation clusters occur rather than mutations being randomly distributed. And the generation of so-called genomic mutational hotspots is actually thought to have been critical in our own human evolution. Now, of course, as we were saying, those DNA mutations provide the raw material of the evolutionary process, which generates slightly different phenotypes upon which natural selection can then operate. Such genetic variations can arise in many, many different ways, listed some of them up there on the screen: cell replication, radiation, chemical mutagens, sexual reproduction, gene flow, retroviral insertions, chromosomal rearrangements. There's a great long list of ways of bringing variation into the DNA. Now, the point here, of course, is, as I was saying, it doesn't really make any difference whether DNA variation comes about as a result of epistemic chance, if you want to call it that, or ontological chance. Natural selection will operate in populations on any variation that makes a difference to the phenotype. Now, I think at this stage it's quite helpful to stand back for a moment and just remind ourselves of the whole sweep of evolutionary history. I think in many ways, as you look at it, with that great big arrow there, it looks a bit like a drama. Indeed, some have called it a theodrama. Striking increase in biological complexity since life began about 3.8 billion years ago is pretty obvious. For the first 2.5 billion years of life on Earth, things only really got bigger than about 1 millimeter across, about the size of a pinhead. No birds, no flowers, no animals wandering around, no fish in the sea, but at the molecular, at the genetic level, there was lots going on with the generation of many of the genes and biochemical systems that were later used to such effect to build the bigger, more complex living things that we see all around us today. And many of the genes in our bodies, as we're sitting here, evolved during that particular era. But it wasn't until the start of multicellular life from around 1.6 billion years ago that living organisms started to get bigger, although first still on a scale of millimeters rather than centimeters. And it's thought that multicellularity has evolved independently at least 20 times since life began. The land was still quite barren of life until around 1 billion years ago. Only in the so-called Cambrian explosion during the period 505 to 525 million years ago do we find sponges and algae growing up to 5 to 10 centimeters across, and the size of animals begin to increase dramatically from that time onwards until today. We have creatures like ourselves with our brains with 10 to 11 neurons, with 10 to 14 synaptic connections or whatever it is, the most complex known entities in the universe. People with minds, people who can ponder on the meaning of the universe and why we're here. I think when you stand back and look at it, you can see why some people would like to call this a theodrama. It's very dramatic. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that increased complexity and directionality are features of life all the way along. Absolutely not. As you will know, 99% of all the species that ever lived have gone extinct. But if we stand back and look at that evolutionary history as a whole, then personally I just think the sense of drama involved there is overwhelming. And I find it interesting that the idea of progress in evolutionary history is found as much in the discourse of atheists like Richard Dawkins as it is in the language of evolutionary biologists with religious worldviews. As Richard Dawkins comments, the cumulative build-up of complex adaptations like eyes strongly suggests a version of progress, especially when coupled in imagination with some of the wonderful products of convergent evolution. Now, as it happens, we have the world's expert in the subject of convergent evolution, Simon Comyn-Morris, speaking to us on the final talk of this afternoon. But to take that example that so impressed Dawkins, just as it so impressed Darwin 150 years earlier, different types of eye, both camera and compound, have evolved more than 20 different times independently during the course of evolution. 96% of all animal species contain a complex optical system. If you live in a planet of light and darkness, then you need eyes, so that's what you're going to get. So even though the eye has a highly complex structure, it keeps appearing repeatedly, independently. Now, if you want to study this fascinating phenomenon in more detail, then I'm going to give a plug to these two books by Simon, who's sitting here. And, here we've got some hundreds and hundreds of examples in these two books of convergent evolution. And I think what these examples highlight is the highly organized process of evolution, acting like a search engine, if you like, looking for designed space and repeatedly coming up with the same adaptive solutions to living in different environments. On a planet which has, after all, gravity, heat, cold, light, and darkness, and so on. It's really a remarkable story. And I want to just carry on here to think about the two main ways in which this happens, one going on at the level of organisms and one going on at the level of molecules. At the level of organisms, of course, no one believes that this two-phase or two-step process of DNA variation and natural selection is the only mechanism involved in evolution. Evolutionary theory has been expanding with the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis. That in turn represents a whole bundle of other causes and factors that are influential in the evolutionary process. So we have evo-devo, niche construction, cooperation, epigenetics, inheritance, agency, mechanical constraints, much else besides. That's a huge topic in itself. But if you're interested, I put up there this particular website at the bottom there, where you'll find out a lot more about extended evolutionary synthesis. But last year, a nice book of 18 essays was published by the MIT Press in America entitled Evolution on Purpose, Teleonomy in Living Systems. The word teleonomy, as you know, refers to a program or set of mechanisms that generate goal-directed behavior, and so it's a type of teleology, if that helps. But what's fascinating to note, I think, is that introducing purposeful words like teleonomy back into evolutionary biology is now becoming much more respectable in academic publications. As we read in the introduction to this book, and I quote, "Perhaps most significant theoretically, there has been a growing recognition that the purposeful teleonomic behavior of living organisms and cells has had a major influence in shaping the course of evolution over time," close quote. And along with these striking developments at the level of organisms has come equally striking discoveries at the level of the molecules of life and how they've self-organized to bring about life in the first place. And as a retired molecular immunologist, I love molecules. And so I am delighted by this development. And I only have time to give you just a couple of examples of what I mean by this. These are both very recent examples, some of the work not yet fully published, actually. The first example comes from Art Louis, Professor of Theoretical Physics at Oxford, who gave a lecture on this topic here in Cambridge a few months ago. And the basic question is, how do functional RNA molecules appear? So here is a ribozyme. This is an RNA molecule that has catalytic activity like an enzyme, and so it has the potential to catalyze its own replication. That's why some scientists working on the origin of life think that these molecules might have played a key role in getting life started. But let's imagine that you had an RNA molecule just 126 nucleotides or gene letters long, containing the 4 different genetic letters used by RNA. Now, let's say you try and generate every possible sequence of your 4 letters in your stretch of 126 genetic letters, and it turns out the result would be about 10 to the 75 different possibilities. With just one molecule of each possibility, the total RNA mass would be bigger than the mass of the known universe. So that clearly generates a big puzzle. How can life ever get going on this planet, or anywhere else for that matter, if you need a very specific RNA sequence to generate a useful function? How could that happen if the process was completely mathematically random? And of course the answer is that it's not random. So what Art's research group did was first study all the structures of all the functional RNA molecules that are found in the big database shown here, which is known as RNA Central. Now remember, there are many different types of RNA, and this database contains all those particular functional types. It doesn't contain the non-coding RNA, all the coding RNA. Okay. So, as you'll know, these molecules are central to life as we know it. What Art's group was able to show is that there are somewhere between 1,000 and 100,000 nucleotide sequences that account for all the RNA shapes that you find in living things, as expressed in this particular database at least. Now, clearly that's a tiny number compared to the huge number of theoretically possible sequences. So what's going on? So what Art's group did was to take the 4 genetic letters that you find in RNA molecules and randomize them hundreds of thousands of times to see what RNA sequences and so structures you might come up with. And what they discovered was that the RNA shapes they recovered from the set of random RNA sequences were the same as those that occur for the RNA molecules found in the database. That is to say, found in that database of all the RNA molecules that we know about in living organisms today. And as Art was saying in his lecture, it's a bit like looking for a needle in the haystack, and every time you stick in your hand, you pull out a needle. Hence the picture of a haystack, by the way, just in case you're puzzled there. Anyway, so the point here, of course, is arriving at functional RNA molecules seems a lot easier than you might first appear. The chemistry is already set up in such a way that functional RNA molecules are much more likely to be generated. The chemistry causes molecules to be generated. that turn out to be essential for life as we know it. The process is not mathematically random. Okay, the second molecular example I'm going to give is a little bit similar, but this time it's from proteins, and it comes from a collaboration between the Sanger Center here and the Center for Genomic Regulation in Barcelona. It was published a few months ago in the journal Science. Again, for a long time, it was a big puzzle how the functional sequences of 20 different amino acids from which proteins are formed could evolve. Take a small protein again, in this case just 60 amino acids in length. In theory, it could be constructed in 10 to the 78 different ways. Again, we're up to more than the total number of atoms in the universe. And according to the classical view of protein stability, most changes to the building blocks of a protein could knock the whole structure out of shape. So the odds of evolution finding a safe route to creating new proteins seemed very small. These groups looked at the SH3 domains of an enzyme called FIN. FIN, by the way, is an old friend of mine. It's a tyrosine kinase, if you really want to know. They looked at that over 1 billion years of evolutionary history, plus some other proteins. They generated a model for measuring protein stability and then compared the model against 51,159 functional SH3 sequences found in public databases, all very varied in their sequence, spanning life from bacteria to plants, insects, and humans. And what they found is that their model algorithm correctly flagged almost all SH3 domains as stable, despite their great variation in amino acid sequence. So, to cut a long story short, one take-home message from their paper is that evolving functional proteins seems to be, if you like, a lot easier than first thought. There are many, many routes. And so maybe our planet is fine-tuned for life to occur. That seems to be the way the many current discoveries are heading. I recommend this book by the Badisch Andreas Wagner, entitled Arrival of the Fittest, because he's carried out multiple computer-based investigations of the evolution of proteins, genotype networks, things like that. And again, the same message comes through very clearly. There are many routes to molecular functionality in biology. In fact, Wagner calls it the hidden architecture of life. Now, at this stage, I do hear somebody saying, well, does all this mean that I'm about to derive my own ideology from the theory of evolution? Okay. And I want to say, no, absolutely not. That is not the case, because all I'm saying here is that when you actually look at evolution, it's quite clear it's not a theory of chance or mathematical randomness, and therefore necessarily purposeless, but instead displays many examples of constraint, progress, and directionality. And so those who wish to base their ideology on the interpretation that evolution is necessarily purposeless, I would suggest are simply mistaken. But having said that, whereas evolution per se is certainly not going to tell you the purpose of life, I don't think, it does provide some pretty important clues. And I think it's consistent with the idea of a creator God who fulfills his intentions and purposes through the evolutionary process. Christian theology can readily incorporate evolution into its worldview, providing an added rich layer of purpose and meaning in the process. As the 19th century cleric and curator of the Oxford Botanical Gardens, Aubrey Moore, once commented, Darwinism appeared and under the guise of a foe did the work of a friend. Closing, let me just mention a couple of relevant books that will be available on the bookstall during the reception later. Is there purpose in biology, especially relevant to this particular topic? Let me mention also creation or evolution. Do we have to choose? Clearly with an answer, no. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, sir.